On a summer evening in 1892, in the North Carolina town of Winston, a young woman named Mary Ellen Smith walked out to meet a man in the woods, and she never came home. She was about 18 years old. She cooked and cleaned in other people's houses. For her keep, she had come to town alone from the country, and she had almost no one in the world who would think to ask after her. When she was found the next morning, the people who had barely noticed her in life looked at what was left of her and decided, almost without thinking, that she had been no one at all. What makes her story a strange one, and not only a sad one, is this. From the very first hour, the whole town knew the name of the man who had killed her, and still it would take 2 years, the stubbornness of one woman who came down out of the hills to fight for her, and the last public hanging the county would ever hold before anyone answered for what was done to Mary Ellen Smith. To understand how that could happen, you have to know the town she died in. Winston that summer was a place in a hurry. Tobacco money had poured in for a generation, and the population had doubled in 10 years. At the top of the highest ground in the city stood the proof of all that money, the Hotel Zinzendorf, built around a tower 85 feet high, with electric lights and elevators and running water on every floor. It had cost some $300,000, and from its frame to its shingles, it was made almost entirely of wood. When it opened, the management let it be known in the local paper that it meant to employ white help principally in every department. Below the hotel lay a long sloping lawn and a wooded spring, and the guests called it the pleasure ground. For the people who could afford a room, it was a place to take the evening air. For the young women who cooked and cleaned and did the laundry for them, it was a quiet place to cut through on the way home. It was there, in those woods below the Grand Hotel, that Mary Ellen Smith went to meet the man whose name was already on a note in her pocket, and it was there, the next morning, that the town would find her. Her name was Mary Ellen Smith, though by the time she died, most people had dropped the Mary and simply called her Ellen. She was born around 1874, out in Forbush, in Yadkin County, into a household of women that her grandmother kept. There was not much money in it, and not much margin. Like a great many country girls of slender means, she went into service young, and she came to Winston to work in other people's homes. By the spring of 1889, she was a domestic in the household of a man named Kenny Rose, a store clerk in town. She was so small and so slight that Rose later said he had taken her for about 13 years old when she came to him. He thought her a fair cook. He also said, in the plain and careless way of the time, that she was not bright. It is one of the few descriptions of her that survives, and it tells us more about the men who set down the record than it does about the girl herself. Somewhere in those years, she met Peter de Graaf. He was a few years older, a local man with light eyes and a thin mustache, known for liking his whiskey and for keeping company with young women. He was a careful dresser, never without a good hat. He took Ellen about the town. A Trade Street merchant remembered de Graaf bringing her into his store, introducing her as his girl, and telling the man to let her have whatever she liked. She took very little, the merchant said, some candy and a few small things, and de Graaf settled the account at the end of each month. Then, as happened to so many young women in those years, and was so seldom laid at the feet of the men responsible, Ellen found herself in trouble. When she did, she was not entirely without kindness around her. A man named Mike Davis took her into his home while she was carrying the child. In 1891, she went back to her people in Yadkin County for the birth, and the child did not live. She returned to Winston and to the Rose household, and she took up again with the same man. By the summer of 1892, she was carrying a second child. We do not know what she hoped for, and we are not entitled to guess. What the record allows us to say is only this: she was very young. She was nearly alone in a town that owed her nothing, and the one man she should have been able to count on was the one who would do her the most harm. By that summer, something in Ellen had changed. She had begun, it seems, to want to be free of him. In the days before she died, she had someone write a letter for her to Peter de Graaf, telling him plainly that she did not want to see him again. She could not write it herself, so she dictated it, and another hand set it down. It was, as far as the record shows, the clearest thing she ever said about the man, and she said it trying to get away from him. His answer came as a note, and the note did not threaten. It pleaded. It told her he had loved her all his life, asked her not to think hard of him, and begged her to come to him, just once more, at the spring in the woods below the hotel. What happened in those woods, no one saw. What was found there the next morning, we know. A young woman named Hattie Pratt worked in the laundry of the Hotel Zinzendorf. As she came to work that morning, she met a young man near the trees, dressed in a brown suit and a black derby hat. He told her there was the body of a woman lying in the woods, and that she ought to go and see who it was. He walked her part way in, and then he turned and left. Hattie Pratt went on alone. She saw a white apron hanging from a low branch, and then, in the brush a few steps off the path, she saw the girl. Ellen Smith had been shot a single time, through the side. There were powder marks on the apron that had been taken from her and hung on the branch, which told the men who came that the shot had been fired close. There was no sign of any struggle. She had been laid, almost carefully, on a bed of green boughs. In the pocket of the apron was the note that had brought her there. It was signed by Peter de Graaf. She had written to tell him she was through with him, and he had answered with a letter sweet enough to bring her back into the trees one last time. There was no mystery here, and no question to be puzzled out. The town knew within the hour whose hand had done this. What the town did not yet know was how little, for a long while, it would care. This is the part of the story the old song never tells. When the officials had finished in the woods, several men picked up Ellen Smith's body and carried it openly through the streets of Winston to the town hall. There, the next morning, the county physician, a Dr. Dalton, performed the post-mortem on a table, in plain view of a number of idlers who had wandered in to watch. In a town that thought of a poor and unclaimed body as so much public business, this was not a scandal. It was routine. No one knew quite who she was, and no one in authority took much trouble to find out. Her best clothes were fetched from the Rose House, where her employer was at work, and his wife had little to say. It was decided that the dead girl was an indigent, an orphan, a person of no particular connection to anyone. She was placed in a coffin, taken out to the county poorhouse, and buried in the pauper's field. No word was sent to Yadkin County. No one rode out to tell her grandmother, or her aunts, or the family of women who had raised her, that Mary Ellen Smith was dead. It did not occur to the town to ask whether she belonged to anyone, because the town had already decided that she did not. She had been killed once with a pistol in the woods, and then a whole community looked at what was left of her, a young, poor, dark-skinned girl who had worked in its kitchens, and quietly agreed among themselves that she had been no one at all. That second judgment, the one with no gun in it, is the true heart of what went wrong in Winston, and it is the thing her family would come down out of the hills to undo. While her grave in the pauper's field was still fresh, the newspapers went to work on her. Winston in those years had several papers, and they did not agree about much. One of them, the most conservative in town, took up the dead girl and turned her over in print as a thing to be judged. It described her as a woman of low character, suggested she had brought her end upon herself, and went so far as to float the idea that her own unknown father might have been the man who killed her. The killer's name was on the note in her pocket, and still the paper reached past him to find some way to lay the blame on her. Another paper went after the sheriff instead, hammering at him week after week for letting de Graaf walk free. until its language came dangerously near to inviting the town to take matters into its own hands. The town, meanwhile, knew exactly where its sympathies lay, and it was not shy about saying so in print. Two men published an open challenge to Peter de Graaf in one of the papers, daring him to meet them and inviting him to bring a friend and a shotgun. It was bluster, the kind of thing men wrote to be seen writing, but it tells you that everyone knew who he was and where he might be found, while the law did nothing. The terms these papers used about Ellen Smith were the terms of their day, about her color and about her supposed morals. And they are ugly to read now. They were meant to settle the matter. A girl like that, the columns implied, was not really the town's concern. So in the weeks after her death, Mary Ellen Smith was tried in the Winston papers and found wanting, while the man who had signed the note in her apron drank where he pleased. She had no one to speak for her. The people who had known her best were 40 miles away and did not yet know she was gone. That was about to change. When word at last reached Yadkin County of what had happened and of how it had been handled, one woman got up and came to Winston to answer for it. Her name was Rosa Smith. She was Ellen's aunt, a working woman who made her living with a needle. She had no money to speak of, and no standing in the town, and none of that stopped her. She took a room at a boarding house on the main street, settled in, and made herself heard. She went after every official who had touched her niece's case, the sheriff, the coroner, the physician, and she said plainly and loudly what had been done, that Ellen had been carried through the streets like so much refuse, that she had been laid out for strangers to gawk at, that she had been shoveled into a pauper's grave as though she had fallen out of nowhere and belonged to nobody, when in truth she had a family and a name and people who had loved her, and something began to turn. The same conservative paper that had smeared the dead girl, sensing which way the wind had shifted, came around to Rosa's side. The town that had decided Ellen Smith was no one was made, by one stubborn woman in a rented room, to look again at what it had done. There is a great deal we do not know about Rosa Smith. The record does not give us her own words, and so we will not put words in her mouth. What it gives us instead is better, because it is true. It gives us what she did. A woman who had every reason to believe that nothing she did would matter, in a town that had already closed the book on her niece, refused to let the book stay closed. She was not finished. She had only begun. For nearly a year, Peter de Graaf was a free man. The note had named him. A warrant was sworn out at once. And then, for month after month, almost nothing was done. The first sheriff of Forsyth County did not bring him in. People said de Graaf was seen drinking in the barrooms of Winston and Salem, that he came and went as he pleased, and that he had once stood in a saloon and raised a glass to the sheriff's health. He had not gone far. He had taken a train north to Mount Airy, some 35 miles off, and gone to work at a sawmill under a borrowed name, and there he might have stayed safe for the rest of his life. He had slipped away from trouble before. As a boy of 16, jailed because he could not pay a $10 fine for carrying a pistol, he had dug through the floor of his cell and lowered himself out on knotted sheets, and was never punished for it. What undid him in the end was not detective work. It was an election. The county put in a new sheriff, a man who had run on a promise of law and order, and within months of that promise, de Graaf was recognized stepping off a train. The new sheriff and his officers went out past the saloon 2 miles west of the courthouse, where de Graaf had once worked, and they found him in a house nearby, hiding under a feather mattress. He gave himself up without a fight and asked only to be treated as a gentleman. He was taken to jail to stand trial at last, 2 years after the woman he killed had been buried as a stranger. When the trial came, in the late summer of 1893, Rosa Smith did the thing no one expected a poor country woman to be able to do. She made sure her niece had a real prosecution. She did not trust that the case would be pressed hard enough by the elected solicitor alone. So she went out and raised the money, herself, to hire two of the best lawyers in that part of the state to help conduct the prosecution. Both of them were men who would one day run for governor of North Carolina. A girl whom the town had buried for free now had, because of her aunt, some of the finest legal talent in the Piedmont, rising to speak for her, the courtroom filled with men. A murder trial, with all its hard and ugly testimony, was thought no place for a respectable woman. Rosa Smith sat in the front row anyway, every day, through the whole of it. The trial ran 3 days and called 42 witnesses and cost the county $178. Among those who testified was Mike Davis, the man who had once taken Ellen into his home. He told the court that DeGraff had admitted the killing to him. He was a black man giving evidence against a white one, and when he had finished, 2 white men were brought forward to swear that he was of good character, as though the truth of what he said depended on their word for him. It is a small moment in the record, and it says a great deal about the town Ellen Smith had lived and died in. And at the center of it all was the small piece of paper found in her apron, the note that had drawn her to the spring. One of Rosa's hired lawyers stood and read it aloud, the letter of a man who said he had loved her all his life and begged her not to fail to come to him. She had not failed to come. That was the whole of the cruelty of it. She had written to be rid of him, and he had answered with sweetness, and the sweetness had been bait. The jury did not take long. They found Peter DeGraff guilty of murder in the 1st degree. The carelessness that had marked Ellen Smith's case from the morning her body was found followed it all the way to the end. It had begun with a single clerical mistake. A justice of the peace had set down the wrong date on an early document, and no one had caught it. That error simply traveled down through the whole proceeding, through the lawyers and the clerks and the judge, until it lodged in the verdict itself, which gave a day for her death more than a month off from the day she actually died. The machinery of the law could not be troubled to get right even the date on which the woman at the heart of it had been killed. The conviction held. DeGraff's lawyers appealed, and the state's highest court turned them down. They asked the governor for mercy, and the governor refused and signed the warrant for the hanging. To the last, in a string of florid letters to the newspapers, DeGraff insisted he was innocent and promised that one day the real killer would be found. A date was set, and the town that had once buried Ellen Smith without a word now prepared to gather in its thousands to watch the man who killed her die. It was set for a day in February of 1894. They chose a Thursday on purpose, for by then a great many people held that Fridays, the old day for hangings, were unlucky. By most accounts, some 6,000 people came. The road from town out to the county poorhouse, where the gallows stood, was lined with wagons and buggies and carts, and hundreds more came on foot. People brought their lunches. The mood, more than one witness said, was the mood of a circus. Among the crowd was a boy named George Black, who would grow up to be a famous brickmaker, and who remembered that day for the rest of his long life. He and his brother had come early. A deputy stretched a rope across the field and warned the boys that if they crossed it, they would be put up on the scaffold too. Black called that scaffold the stage, because to the crowd that is what it was. There was at least one man who could not bear to be there. Peter DeGraff's father, an old basket maker who had come over from France as a young man, did not go to watch his son hang. He stayed home that day, and it is said that he spent the hours gathering firewood in his yard, doing the small, steady work of his hands, so that he would not have to think. On the scaffold, DeGraff at last said the thing he had denied for 2 years. He admitted he had shot her. He said he had been drunk, and he warned the young men pressed against the rope to stay away from liquor and gambling and bad company, or they would come to the place he had come to. Of the woman herself he said only that, After the shot, the one thing she had said was a prayer for mercy. Then the hood was drawn down, the trap was sprung, and it took about 7 minutes for him to die. George Black kept the warning. He said, many years later, that he had lived his whole life by what he heard that man say. He never drank. He never gambled. It was the last public hanging Forsyth County would ever hold, and the crowd that had come for a spectacle got one, and then folded their blankets and drove home. The woman whose death had brought them all out there was hardly mentioned. She was already 2 years in the ground. Rosa Smith did not have long to rest in what she had won. Less than a year after the hanging, the aunt who had come down out of Yadkin County and forced a whole town to look again at her niece died of pneumonia. She was 36 years old. She was carried home and buried at a country church near where Ellen had been born. The Grand Hotel above the pleasure ground did not outlast the story either. On Thanksgiving Day of 1892, with de Graaf still at large, the Hotel Zinzendorf caught fire in its laundry and burned to the ground in about 2 hours, and it was never rebuilt. In time, a song was made, and it carried Ellen Smith's name far further than her short life ever took her. It did not appear in print until about 1911, 17 years after the hanging, and for all its sorrow, it got nearly everything wrong. It sang of a body mangled and thrown about the ground, when there had been a single shot and a girl laid gently on green boughs. It sang of a lonesome grave, when in truth she does not lie alone at all. In some versions it sang of an innocent man wrongly hanged, the very lie de Graaf had told to the end. Here is what is true. Mary Ellen Smith and the man who killed her were buried only a few yards apart, out by the old county poorhouse. The ground where they lie has long since been paved over, and today it rests beneath a county maintenance yard near the runways of the airport, with nothing above it to say who is there. The town gave Ellen Smith back her name in the end. Her aunt saw to that, at a cost the town never repaid. It gave her back her name and a measure of justice and a place in a song that got her wrong. It did not give her much else.